The house smelled the same even after all this time, rosemary chicken polished wood, and the faint perfume my mother wore only on birthdays. I hadn't been here in 3 years yet nothing had changed. The chime still jingled offbeat when the front door opened. The same floral wallpaper, the same creaky third step on the stairs, even the same tablecloth yellowing slightly pressed flat over the long oak table. My mother Miriam was beaming at the head of the table wearing a navy blouse too formal for our usual family chaos. My father carved the roast like it required precision surgery, and Clara sat directly across from me, arms rested on the table wine glass, tilted just enough to let the light catch the ring on her finger. Not my old ring, I noticed. Just a new one she wore like a badge. She looked good. But she always did. That had never been the issue. She leaned forward slightly enough for her voice to carry, but still feel like a secret. "Still alone, sis." Her smile was tight-curved more by performance than joy. I didn't rush to answer. I reached for the salad tongs, spooned myself a few baby greens, and set them down with care. Then I lifted my gaze slow and steady. "Not really," I said softly. Her smirk twitched, confused, just for a second. I felt my mother glance up from the bowls, her movement hesitant. My father's hands paused on the carving knife. Then came the sound. The front door creaked open. A coat brushed the wall. Footsteps measured confident. Lucan stepped into the dining room like he belonged there. Navy coat, dark slacks, quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. His eyes scanned the room briefly, then found mine. He smiled a smile meant only for me and crossed the space in a few strides. "Sorry I'm late," he murmured, kissing the side of my head, his hand settling gently at the small of my back. Traffic was brutal. The fork dropped from Clara's hand, hitting her plate with a sharp metallic clatter. Her jaw stiffened. Beside her, Noah didn't move at all. I smoothed the hem of the tablecloth and leaned slightly into Lucan's warmth. I hadn't come to impress anyone, but it seemed I had. 3 years earlier, the air in my parents' backyard was thick with late summer. Lavender from the garden mixed with the sweetness of grilled peaches, and the whole place shimmered under strings of lights we'd spent the morning hanging. My mother bustled between tables, fussing over cheese platters and cloth napkins. Music floated from a speaker. Clara had insisted we use something soft, instrumental, forgettable. It should have been the happiest night of my life. Guests filtered in slowly, friends from college, neighbors I hadn't seen in years, my aunt holding a gift bag with too much tissue paper, and Noah. My Noah, laughing easily in a linen shirt sleeves, rolled just enough to show the scar on his forearm from that camping trip where we got caught in the rain. Every time I looked at him, something swelled in my chest, but also something twisted. Something I had no name for yet. Clara moved through the party like a breeze, effortless and too present. She hugged Noah twice that evening. I noticed. I tried not to. Midway through the night, the air shifted. A breeze crept through the apple trees, and goosebumps prickled along my arms. I remembered the shawl I'd left in the front hall. Quietly, I slipped away from the laughter through the kitchen into the house. It was quiet inside. That stillness that comes right before sunset when everything holds its breath. That's when I heard them, voices low and close, a breathy laugh. Clara's. I moved down the hallway barefoot, my steps nearly silent against the wood. Through the open doorway of the den, I saw them. Noah standing too close. Clara's hand in his hair, his fingers at her waist. They weren't speaking. They were leaning in like magnets that had already chosen each other. I froze. My mind couldn't make sense of it, but my body understood immediately. They didn't see me at first. I had time to watch them like a stranger would, like I wasn't the woman who had planned to spend her life with him, like I hadn't called Clara my best friend since childhood. When they finally turned and saw me, no one said a word. Later I would wonder how long I stood there. I didn't stay for goodbyes. By the time the sun rose over the hills behind my parents' house, I had already packed what I could fit into the trunk of my car. I left the pale green dress draped over the foot of the bed. The engagement ring, still in its velvet box, sat silently beside the bathroom sink. On the kitchen counter, I left a note that said, "Only I need time." I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just drove. I headed south, following no real plan except distance. By the time I reached Santa Fe 2 days later, I was running more on instinct than intention. I found a month-to-month sublet above a bakery, the walls still smelling faintly of burnt sugar and stale coffee. It had a mattress on the floor and one window that stuck halfway open. That was enough. I didn't tell anyone where I was. Not my parents, not old friends, certainly not Clara. I deleted Noah's number without rereading any messages, blocked his email, threw out the journal where I'd sketched ideas for our wedding. Grief didn't look like sobbing into pillows or smashing picture frames. It looked like silence. Heavy, vast, endless silence. I found a small studio space down a side street with cracked adobe walls and bad lighting. The owner didn't ask many questions. I unpacked my old tools, pliers, wire, stones I'd hoarded for years and started making again. First out of habit, then out of desperation, then out of something else entirely. People came and went, tourists, a few locals. I learned how to smile without offering anything. I said my name softly, wrote receipts by hand, and let days pass without noticing. I didn't attend gallery shows. I didn't date. I didn't talk about Montana. Trust as a word felt like something fragile I'd once broken. Now I kept it in a locked drawer out of reach. And yet one night, nearly 6 months later, something in me stirred. An invitation slipped through the door, taped to the outside of my studio. I nearly threw it away, but then, without knowing why I didn't. The gallery was louder than I expected. Clinks of glasses, the hum of curated conversation, a string quartet tucked into one corner, playing something dissonant on purpose. I had almost turned around at the door, the kind of crowd that noticed things. But I walked in anyway, my name scribbled on a sticker I didn't bother to wear. I wandered past the first few canvases without looking at them. Too much color, not enough quiet. Then I heard a voice behind me, low, amused. "Tell me that isn't supposed to be a horse." I turned. Lucan Ellery. The name didn't come to me right away, but the face did, sharper now, a little older. At my engagement party years ago, he'd stood near the back during the toast, one of Noah's graduate school friends, rarely speaking. I hadn't expected to see him again, let alone here. "I think it's a commentary on capitalism," I offered, unsure why I felt compelled to respond at all. He smiled, not unkindly. That's the safe answer in every gallery. We ended up side by side for the rest of the exhibit, making quiet observations that only sometimes veered into sarcasm. He didn't ask about Noah, didn't mention Clara. He asked what I did now, and when I told him about the jewelry studio, he seemed genuinely curious. Not performative, not fishing, just listening. I told him my pieces were usually quiet things. He nodded and said, "We could use more quiet things in the world." We parted outside under the soft glow of street lamps. He walked with his hands in his coat pockets, unhurried. Before he turned the corner, he glanced back and said, "Hope I see you at the next capitalist critique." For the first time in a long time, I laughed without it catching in my throat. Back at home, I set my keys down and stood still in the kitchen for a moment, unsure why I felt different. Not changed exactly, just less heavy. The next morning, when I opened the studio, I found a cup of coffee waiting on the steps with oat milk and a tiny pinch of cinnamon. Lucan never knocked. He just tapped twice on the glass pane of the studio door and walked in, always holding 2 coffees and something ridiculous to say about whatever song was playing. We had started sharing playlists, his full of obscure jazz and melancholy blues, mine cluttered with instrumental piano, and the occasional guilty pop track I didn't admit to liking. The thing between us didn't arrive with thunder or urgency. It settled gradually, like morning dew, so quietly I didn't notice until I looked up one day and realized he'd been part of my routine for weeks. We spent Saturday mornings walking through the farmers' market Sundays, in silence reading next to each other, and weekday afternoons arguing about whether lavender belonged in dessert. He was steady in a way I hadn't realized I needed, not dramatic, not pushy, just there. One evening, as we were closing up the studio after I'd helped him pick out a necklace for his cousin's anniversary gift, he lingered at the door, eyes not quite meeting mine. Clara tried to flirt with me once, he said abruptly. I didn't answer, just waited. It was awkward, he added. She asked if I collected women the way I collected paintings. I told her I preferred authenticity. I exhaled, not because it shocked me, but because hearing her name again made my chest ache in a place I thought had finally scarred over. She hated that I didn't chase, he said, but I already knew who I was looking at. He didn't have to say it was me. He didn't have to explain how he'd seen it all and still chosen this quiet, unfinished version of me who was still gluing herself back together. That night we sat on my fire escape with mugs of mint tea legs, brushing the world slowing down between us. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't try to fix anything. Just let me lean my head on his shoulder until the stars blurred overhead. And when I fell asleep beside him for the first time, it wasn't fear that stirred in me, but calm. The kind that says you're safe here. We didn't plan it, not in the way people usually do. One morning in early spring, Lucan looked up from his coffee and said, "There's a courthouse in Durango that still uses paper ledgers. We could go there." I nodded before I even finished my toast. We drove through the mountains in silence, the kind that wraps around you instead of pressing in. I wore jeans and a soft gray sweater. Lucan wore the navy coat I loved. Neither of us brought rings, not out of rebellion, just simplicity. The clerk gave us a form with too many boxes. Judge Mina Rowe had soft eyes and a voice that made you want to listen. She asked if we had witnesses. We didn't. But two elderly strangers in the hallway offered to step in, saying they hadn't seen a wedding in years. When I said my vows, the woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with tiny violets. Lucan said, "I promise to be the quiet beside your storm, if ever you have one again." And I felt something in me shift, like the lock I didn't know I still carried had clicked open. Afterward, we walked to a nearby bakery and shared a raspberry tart still warm from the oven. The crust crumbled onto Lucan's coat. He grinned and said it was perfect. Not the mess the moment. We drove back as snow began to dust the edges of the road. He didn't ask if I'd tell my parents. He didn't ask if Clara or Noah would ever know. He just held my hand at the red lights and kept driving. Back in Santa Fe, we didn't frame the license or announce the news. We hung a small copper wind chime by the front door, instead, something that would move only when the air felt just right. And still, the quiet between us grew into something solid, something true, the kind of love not meant for display, but for anchoring you when everything else tries to pull you under. It wasn't long before the past came knocking again. The envelope was cream-colored thick, addressed in my father's blocky handwriting. It arrived on a Tuesday, wedged between a utility bill and a catalog I hadn't subscribed to. I almost tossed it, but something about the way my name was written, Alicia Wren, with no middle name, no nickname, just formal and plain, made me pause. Inside was a folded card. No flowery language, no apology. Just your mother's turning 70. One dinner, that's all I ask. Dad. I read it 3 times before setting it on the windowsill. Lucan found it that night tucked beneath a dusty pot of rosemary. He didn't ask. He just picked it up, skimmed the words, and met my eyes. "You don't owe them anything," he said softly, "but if you go, I'll be with you." The next morning, I made coffee the same way he always did, oat milk, cinnamon, 1 sugar, and sat with the letter again. The house was quiet. Only the sound of wind brushing against the windows and the faint chime above the door. "I'm not going back for them," I said aloud. Lucan turned from the sink, waiting. "I'm going back for me." We didn't pack much. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell them I'd bring someone. There were no expectations, no plans for reconciliation, just the steady beat of a decision I couldn't explain except that something in me needed to see the house again, needed to walk through the rooms where everything had broken and prove I no longer lived inside any of it. We drove north 2 days before the dinner. I watched familiar exits pass in reverse memories, clinging to road signs and hills. The closer we got to Bozeman, the quieter I became. When we pulled into my parents' driveway, the porch light was already on, flickering in the soft dusk. The front door was open just a crack, like it had been waiting this whole time. I took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and felt the weight of 3 years settle somewhere behind me. Then I reached for Lucan's hand and we walked up together. The house hadn't changed. The porch creaked in the same place. The wind chime, dented on one side from a storm years ago, still swung lazily by the window. Even the flower beds were overgrown in the exact same pattern they always were, like time had waited here unmoved. Inside, my mother greeted us with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She commented on how well I looked, as if we'd last spoken last week instead of 3 years ago. My father gave Lucan a quick nod and disappeared into the kitchen under the pretense of checking on the roast. I helped lay the table. Silverware, napkins, water glasses already sweating from the ice. There was a rhythm to it, mechanical and practiced like muscle memory from another life. Then I heard them. Footsteps, heels, and leather soles sharp and purposeful. Clara's voice came first, a sing-song greeting to my mother, then a familiar chuckle. She and Noah walked in together. She was glowing, overdone. He looked pale, drawn like a page someone had tried to erase too many times. Clara spotted me and lit up with mock surprise. Well, look who finally came down from the mountain. Her smile was sugar-laced with vinegar. Still playing the lone wolf, I set the last fork beside the plate, turned toward her, and returned the smile. Calm, anchored. Actually, I said, smoothing the tablecloth, no, I'm married. The words fell like stones in water. Even my mother's hands paused over the salad bowl. My father looked up from his wine glass. Clara blinked. Married. As if on cue, the front door opened. Lucan stepped in. Tall and quiet in his navy coat eyes, finding mine with practiced ease. He crossed the room like he belonged there, like he'd always belonged. Sorry I'm late, he said, kissing my temple gently. I couldn't find parking. Clara's fork slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. Lucan turned to the table, nodding politely at the stunned faces. I reached for his hand and guided him to his seat beside mine. The air thinned and no one said a word. Dinner moved forward as if on trembling rails. Plates passed hands. Conversation stumbled and restarted in awkward low tones. My mother asked Lucan polite questions about his work and where we lived now. My father chewed quietly and offered the occasional like it meant something. Clara hadn't spoken since Lucan arrived, but her eyes hadn't stopped moving, tracking me, our hands, our posture, looking for cracks, for explanations. When dessert came, a lemon tart my mother had baked from an old family recipe, Clara finally lifted her glass and tapped the rim with her spoon. The sound rang too sharply. I'd like to say a few words, she announced, voice syrupy, performative. No one interrupted. It's really quite something, she began, eyes locked on me, to disappear for years, then reappear married to someone none of us have ever met. Her smile was tight. Bold, I'll give you that. I didn't move. Neither did Lucan. I felt his fingertips brush the inside of my wrist, grounding me. Some of us believe in transparency, she continued, but I suppose others prefer to live in secrecy, to slip back in with new names, new rings. That's enough, Clara Noah said. His voice wasn't raised, but it sliced through her words like a wire. She turned to him, blinking. Excuse me, you don't have to do this, he said, shaking his head. You don't need to humiliate her to feel like you won something. Clara stared at him, stunned for a breath, then two. Her lips parted, but whatever words were forming never made it out. Noah pushed back his chair. The legs scraped the floor. I'm going for some air. He walked out without looking at anyone. Clara stood frozen for a moment before grabbing her wine glass and following him. The patio door swung shut behind them with a hollow thud. No one moved. I reached for my glass, took a small sip, and set it down with care. Lucan's hand remained in mine under the table, steady and warm. The evening continued without them, and for the first time in years, I let myself breathe fully. The stars were sharper than I remembered. Montana had that way about it, clear air-wide sky silence that settled on your shoulders like a shawl you didn't ask for. Lucan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting in mine. The road unwound beneath us, like ribbon, mile after mile of familiar dark. I looked back once just before the last bend took the house out of view. Lights still on. Porch still glowing faintly. A silhouette passed behind one of the windows, then disappeared. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone, I said quietly, watching the past slip behind us. I just needed to see it all and feel nothing. Lucan didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The car hummed gently beneath us, a steady rhythm that matched the calm inside my chest. In the back seat, a box of lemon tart sat beside a folded napkin from my mother. She hadn't said much when we left, just offered a strange, lingering look and pressed the container into my hands without a word. I didn't know what it meant. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But I had accepted it the same way I accepted the entire night, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with clarity. They hadn't changed. Not really. And maybe that was the point. I didn't need their apology to live well. I didn't need them to understand the version of me that had grown beyond that house, beyond Clara, beyond Noah. I only needed to know I had returned, faced the wreckage, and walked away unshaken. Lucan squeezed my hand once. No words, just presence, just knowing. We didn't talk for most of the drive. We didn't have to. Outside the window, the mountains gave way to open land and the stars followed us home like silent witnesses. This wasn't revenge. This was freedom.